right, welcome back, guys. Now, in the last video, we looked at the Docker installation, we looked at Docker Desktop, and we talked about the difference between Docker Desktop and Docker Engine. And I remember that I mentioned the fact that the Docker Desktop is, okay if you are using a Windows machine or a Mac machine, or you have a Linux desktop operating system, okay? And we also looked at the requirement for the Docker Desktop. And we looked at the difference between the Docker Desktop and the Docker Engine as well. Okay, now this is where we stopped. We actually installed Docker on EC2 instance using T2 Micro. As we saw in the documentation, the Docker Engine does not have strict memory requirements like the Docker Desktop. So for the Docker Desktop, you needed to have minimum of 4 gig of RAM, but for the Docker Engine, that was not specified. So which means we could actually run Docker on a T2 Micro that has 1 vCPU and 1 gig of RAM. So that is why we used the T2 Micro to install Docker, so that those who do not have Docker Desktop or who cannot install Docker Desktop on their machine can also follow along, all the answer we'll be doing using Docker that we have installed on the EC2 instance. Is that okay? Now we have Docker installed already. So let's connect and let's verify the script, because we used a shell script to bootstrap the whole installation process and to add our Ubuntu user to the Docker group so that our Ubuntu user can also execute Docker commands. All right. So I'm going to come here. So let's click on this example, and then I'm going to open up my terminal, all right, to connect to my EC2 instance. Okay. So we have to navigate to where we have our key. All right. So let's log into that and let's verify the whole installation process. So clear your screen. Now let's do, just a simple Docker command to verify that Docker has actually been installed. So Docker PS is a command that shows you the running containers, right? You want to look at the running containers. Docker PS is the command to run. So this is a simple command to basically verify that our Ubuntu user is able to run Docker commands. Okay, so now we don't need to do sudo docker ps. We don't need to do that, right? So we can just go ahead and say docker ps, all right, and then we can use Docker to run whatever it is that we want to, all right, we can use Ubuntu user rather to run whatever command that we want to run. Is that okay? Now let's try to understand, a few things about Docker, right? Because there are actually 3 levels, all right, like I like to put it, when it comes to, Docker. Now, of course, some of us are familiar with what you call the Docker image, right? You hear image, oh, I want to build a Docker image, I want to build this. And some of us, of course, are familiar or have heard about, containers and all of that. But the question is, how did we come about a container in the first instance? How did we come about images in the first instance? So what led to the creation of the image, or how did we create an image, right? And you're talking about containers. How do we even create a container? How do I start a container, right? Now, that is why I said that there are 3 levels when it comes to Docker, right? Now, you have what you call the Dockerfile, okay? You have what you call the Docker image, okay, and you have what you call the Docker, container. Okay, so these are the 3 things that we want to look at and understand. So what is a Docker file? What is a Docker image? And what is a Docker container? Now, the question again is, how do we create a Docker file? How do we create a Docker image? And how do we create a container? So these 3 things, these questions, we have to find an answer to them. Now, before we get into the answer, let's try to understand these 3 things, because it will greatly help us to understand the whole containerization concept at the end of the day. Now, you have a Docker file. So what is a Docker file? Okay, let's start from there. Now, I'm going to go back to this Docker file that I showed us in the last video. Now, this is a very simple Docker file, all right? And of course, it is written in YAML. Now, if you look at what you have here, there are keywords that we can see here. So we can see from, we can see env, we can see copy, we can see user, and we can see cmd. Okay, now, by the way, if you're using Visual Studio Code like I am using, one extension that I will encourage you to install is go to extensions and search for Docker. All right, and make sure that you have this extension installed. Okay, just install it in your Visual Studio Code because it's going to go a long way to help us to understand some of the things that we are trying to understand right here. Now, going back to Dockerfile. So initially, we said that we have Dockerfile. Okay, we have Docker. All right, images. Let me put it here. And we have Docker, all right, containers. Okay. So these are the three things we want to discuss. Now, what is a Dockerfile and why is it important? Now, first of all, let me state here that there is no Docker image that you will find anywhere that is not built from a Docker file. Okay, so any Docker image that you find anywhere, whether it's on Docker Hub, whether it is on ECR, right? I mean, if you go to any image repository at all, and you can find a Docker image right there, okay, that image was built from a Docker file. Now, what does that even mean? Okay, now let's take a look at it like this. So, what I'm saying is you need a Docker file to produce a Docker image, okay? Because the image will not just come from nowhere, all right? It is derived from something. So in order for you to have a Docker image, you need what? A Docker file. Now, a Docker file is basically a simple YAML file that contains an instruction, okay, on how you want to package your application, the dependencies your application requires to function, and of course, the underlying base image that that application will run on. What am I even saying? All right, now let's take a look at it like this. You have a system that you just bought. Now, imagine that that system comes without an operating system. How do you use it? Right? It becomes unusable. Now, the only way to use that system is to what? Install an operating system, right? Now, that system that you bought that didn't come with an operating system, of course, came with the compute resource, the hardware. So you had the CPU, you had the RAM, you had the LAN port, you have the USB port, you have, all the chips, the graphics chip, the sound card, and every other thing. Now, one of the things that you would have to do is to first understand the make of that laptop or the desktop, whatever it is. Because you cannot just go and take an operating system and just put it on it. What if you install an operating system that is not compatible with some of the chip? For example, let's say you install maybe a Windows operating system and after the installation, the sound was not working. The wireless card was not functioning. So what do? You have to look for hardware drivers to drive those chips in order for you to make use of all of that, right? Now, after you have installed the operating system, now depending again on the operating system that you install, that will inform the kind of application software that can run on that system. Okay? Are you getting that analogy? Now, a Docker file is a simple file where you would define, right, how you want to run your application. So I want to run a Node.js application. What are the things that my Node.js application needs to run? What are the dependencies that this Node.js application requires in order to function? Okay, so in the Docker file, you start with by defining the base image. All right, the base image is defined using the keyword from. And as you can see here, it says the from keyword is used to set the base image for subsequent instruction. Okay, so just like you cannot have an application software installed without first having an OS installed on a system, right? Imagine if you have a phone There's no operating system. The Android OS is not there. I mean, how are you going to use your WhatsApp? How are you going to use your Instagram? How are you going to be able to receive your mails through the Gmail app? How are you going to be able to use a banking application? Right? So, which means the first thing you need is an operating system. And then when an operating system is installed, you can then go ahead and start installing other application packages that you need. So a Docker file, first of all, you have to define what you call a base image. So a base image here is like an operating system. That, since I am building a node application, then I can go to Docker Hub and fetch a node-based image, which means this is an operating system that contains at least the minimum requirements, all right, or the minimum tool that my application requires to run. Okay, and as you can see from the definition here, it says this is the base image. You have to set the base image for what? For subsequent instruction. Which means you define the base image first, which is more like your operating system. And then if you need to expand that base image, you can start installing things, tools, dependencies that the application requires to function. Okay, so I have a simple Windows operating system. I mean, your Windows operating system will not come with everything that you need. I mean, after you have bought your laptop, you now have to start installing applications that you require. And each of these applications sometimes will install their dependencies and other packages that they need to function. So a Docker file, again, defines what you call a base image, which is the starting point. And then after the base image has been defined, you can now start defining other things, other tools that you need. My Node.js requires this particular dependencies. My Node.js requires this particular framework. You can start installing all of that on top of the base image. And sometimes also, if you go to the Docker Hub registry, for example, let's look at the Docker Hub registry. So if I come here and I say Docker Hub, now on the Docker Hub page, there are different images that you can use for different use cases. So for example, if I come here and I say I'm looking for a Node.js image. Now, Docker Hub actually is a place where you can find, different millions of images, right? And we have images that are official, like you can see here. So these are official Docker images, which is actually advised. That is what you should go with if you're deploying to production. There's what you call verified publisher. So those are like their partners, all right, and people who are working with Docker as well. And then they are also sponsored OSS. So OSS basically means, the open source, all right, software. Okay, so here, I think the name is Node. So I'm looking for Node. So this is Node, and it's an official image, and it was updated 6 hours ago, right? And you can see here that it has had over 1 billion pulls, all right, since it's been here. Now, if I click on this Node image, one of the things that you will see is these are the different tags. So here, now if you look at the one we're using, we're just using Node 22. So that's the version that we're using. But if you look at what you have here, you have 23. And if you look at what you have here, you have Alpine 3.19. Okay? Now, all of these tags mean different things depending on what you want to use, or depending on the application you're trying to build. Now, one of the things about Docker is that the images are lightweight. They are not as heavy as your virtual machine images, which can run into gigs. Now, there are images also of Docker that can also get into like maybe 1 gig, 2 gig, 3 gig, depending on the kind of application that you're building. All right? But then the base images, some of them are as light as possible, some of them less than a gig, some of them are 500 megabyte, some of them 400 megabyte, and all of that, right? But then if you look at all of these images, they come with different tags. And that also means that each of the tag that you see here will actually work in specific use cases. Okay, and sometimes in a work environment, you have to test, these different tags in order to be able to settle on the particular tag that you're going to use at the end of the day. Okay, but all of the tags that you see here, they are built from a Dockerfile. And if you look at this statement, it says supported tags and respective Dockerfile links. That tells you that all these images that you see here are derived from a Dockerfile. We're going to talk about how to build an image, how to do all of that, but of course, we need to understand the fundamentals. that an image is not just independent, it is actually built from a file. All right, and then a container, all right, is derived also from an image. Actually, a running image is what you refer to as a container, which means an image that you have started is what you actually refer to what? A container. So you have a Dockerfile that you define, and then from the file you build an image, and then when you run that image, that is what you actually refer to as what? A container. Is that okay? So let's go back to the file. So we have this file that defines everything. So now here we also have environment variable. So the environment variable here, we're using that to define the time zone. And that is where the TZ comes in, the time zone. Now here, inside of this folder, we have a file called server.js, all right? When it's a server, it's a Node.js script. Now what are we doing? We're using the copy command to copy that script into this particular location. So inside of a Node.js application, there's a default location that is called src. The same way you have var www/html for your Apache web server, which serves as the default location for your Apache web server. For the Node.js application also, the default location is the /src folder or directory. So what are we doing? We are copying this server.js into this particular location, right? So basically, that is where this particular script will be executed from. Is that okay? Now here also we are specifying the user command. So this user keyword is basically used to specify the user that you want to use to run your application. Okay? So for some application, you don't need to specify user. You can just do sudo systemctl start. You start the service. But for some application, you have to specify the user that you want to use to start up your application. So in the case of Node, we're using user node. And in some cases also, you don't need to specify any user. You can basically just run your application, as is. All right. But in this case, we're specifying a user. So we're basically saying that this user is the one that has the authority to start or to run this particular script. That's basically what we're saying. And the copy command is basically used to copy the file from the source to the destination. So I have a file here on my own system, and I'm copying that file into, my image. Okay, so the idea at the end of the day is by the time I build an image from this Docker file, right, this server.js would have been copied from my system to the src directory inside of that image, right? So by the time I now run the image as a container, it is going to be serving the server.js from that particular location. All right. So the CMD that you see here, it basically provides a default for executing container. For what? An executing container, which means this line is not going to execute until this image has been started up as a container. So until I execute this particular, image, that is when this particular line will be executed. Okay. So the idea is there's a Dockerfile where you define the base image, which is the operating system, and then all the other things that application needs to run. So you copy your application from your local system into the image, into the image file system. And then by the time you build an image from the Dockerfile, everything that you specify is copied from your local system to the image file system. By the time you run that image as a container, then all the necessary commands that you specified while you are building the image begins, to execute. Okay, so that is the 3-step process. A Dockerfile, an image is built from the Dockerfile, the image is run, and then that is what you now refer to as what? A container. So in other words, a container is basically an image that has been executed. And a Docker image is an image, that is derived from a Dockerfile. So I will stop here. In the next video, we'll talk about how to build an image from this simple Docker file, and then we pick it up from there. Thank you, and I'll see you on the next one.